For as many years as I've been involved with this conference, which I think is since the beginning, 11 years ago, we've had a series of panels like this on the changing role of natural gas in our energy economy, with experts frequently emphasizing its role as an important transitional fuel in our energy mix as we move towards more renewable sources. This year, our conference organizer, David Abel, posed an interesting question, which was the subject of an equally interesting and timely article just last week on Monday in the Los Angeles Times, with a very similar question, which is, how long will natural gas be the foundation of our energy economy? The author of that article, Rob Nikolewski, noted that King Coal has been kicked off the throne, and natural gas is now the nation's leading source of electricity. Abundant and cheap and burning far more cleanly than coal, natural gas has not only helped cripple the coal industry, but it has affected nearly every other source of power that makes up our energy grid. 30 years ago, natural gas was used to provide just about 10% of the country's power generation. Today, that share has grown to more than a third of our nation's power generating sources, and an even higher share here in California. Just a few years ago, we were importing natural gas to meet our energy demands, and today we export our excess supply. And our increasing use of renewable resources for energy, like wind and solar, have added demand for natural gas to help fill the gaps in the intermittent production of energy from such renewable sources. Some experts have noted that the U.S. has enough natural gas to meet the country's energy needs for the next 200 years. The question is whether it will be called upon to do so, and why or why not. So we've assembled a great group of panelists this morning to share their thoughts and perspectives on the question. We'll hear from each of them briefly, and then follow up with some questions from me and perhaps from you in the audience. So let's get right to it. Catherine Ice Boyd has served as the president of the Western States Petroleum Association, better known as WSPA, since 2010, and has been with the association for more than 27 years. She oversees the trade organization's operations and advocacy in 5 Western states: California, Nevada, Arizona, Washington, and Oregon. She currently manages a broad range of association activities, including legislative and regulatory issues associated with transportation fuels policy, air and water quality, climate change, renewable fuels and alternative energy issues, crude oil and natural gas production. And she's a member of or advisor to a number of climate change policy panels and regulatory agencies in all 5 states served by the association. So I'd like to begin by asking Kathy to share some of her comments on this key question, and ask her whether she's willing to hazard even a rough guess as to how long natural gas will remain the foundation of our energy economy. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, and thanks for everybody in the audience attending, and thank you, Bill, very much. So, as I said in the plenary session, for those of you that might have seen that, I'm not a big fan of the word transitional, because I don't think in the space of natural gas it is a transitional piece of the energy mix. I more like to talk about it as not how long it's going to be necessary, but really what are the social, environmental, and economic benefits of having natural gas in the mix. And again, that is to, in the conversation of the right optimal energy mix, how does natural gas role really provide accessible, reliable energy to all and as many people as we can? How does it serve in its role to meet our environmental goals, be they climate change or air quality goals? How does it really fit with the economic equation? How economical is it in the energy mix, and what does that mean to communities and people that we serve? And then how does it play in that whole energy equation of working together with the other energy sources? So that's, as I was reflecting about that last night, there were some really important things that came to mind. It is 60% less greenhouse gas emissions. That certainly is pretty dramatic. I mean, that's a pretty exciting piece of the natural gas story. It has been what has provided us the ability to have 30-year lows in greenhouse gas emissions. And as Bill said, there's enough of it for 200 years to come, are the projections. And so it certainly isn't a piece of the mix that's going away anytime soon. It is reliable, it's affordable, it really helps position the United States in its energy independence, in our national security, and our energy dominance, which is very, very important for the U.S. as we do not want to be leveraged on our opportunities to look at the right energy mix. So it's important in that regard as well. As Bill said, it is the primary energy source for electricity generation. And then a couple of, I thought, very interesting on the economic pillar side, that in 2040, they project in a recent study that was put out that it will save $100 billion in energy costs. Now, what does that really mean? Well, to individual households, that's about $655 a year. And for people in disadvantaged communities, that's a lot to consider. So from the cost standpoint, the AAA also just put out a study where it saves $550 at the pump in 2015, which is another not small number for people that use transportation fuels to better their lives and get around from A to B. It also supported 4 million jobs in the U.S., and they predict in 2040 6 million jobs. So from the jobs argument, it is a wonderful piece of the energy mix. So again, and you know, the greenhouse gas side is clear. It's 2/3 of the reduction in our carbon emissions between the years of 2006 and 2014 came from this one single source. So I think, Bill, just from my perspective, when you put all that together, it isn't, for me, it's not how long is it going to be necessary. It's what are the benefits that we get as we talk about that optimal mix going forward, and how does that feed into all those things we talked about in the plenary session?
So let's bring George Minter into the conversation. George is Regional Vice President of External Affairs and Environmental Strategy for SoCalGas, the 150-year-old provider of gas to Los Angeles, originating for our gas street lamps, and still the primary provider of natural gas to more than 20 million customers throughout Southern California, including for space and water heating for our homes, of course. He's responsible for the company's public affairs, community relations, public policy, and energy and environmental affairs functions. He served as a board member of numerous civic organizations and community organizations, including the Campaign to Clear the Air and the California League of Conservation Voters Foundation. And he's one of the founders of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and the California CCS Coalition. Currently serves as co-chair of Energy, Water, and Environmental Sustainability Council at the LA Chamber, and is a board member at the Coalition for Clean Air and the California Natural Gas Vehicle Coalition. George, your thoughts on the question of the morning?
Well, thank you. I'm going to go a different direction than I have in the past. I'm going to paint a bigger picture. This is the 5th time I think I've been on this panel, which basically articulates the role of natural gas. And so I think most of you probably have heard this before. Those of you that are new, well, maybe you'll hear some new information. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the world. Natural gas, is it going to be the foundational fuel? How long will it be the foundational fuel? Well, let's be clear. In California, it's been the foundational fuel really since the 50s and 60s. 60% of the electricity generated in California is still natural gas. I know we're growing our renewable profile, and we're importing a lot of renewable electricity, and 25% of DWP's imports is coal, by the way. So we're still not entirely off coal. But we're reliant on gas for generation. And how will that change in the future? 90% of Southern Californians use gas every day to heat their home and cook their food. Gas is and has been a foundational fuel. I think in the future, energy will be the foundation of our economy, and there'll be many, many diversified sources of energy. Among them, for a long time to come, will be natural gas. What's natural gas? Natural gas is methane. Today, we explore, produce methane as natural gas from oil and gas reservoirs. It's considered a fossil resource. But methane also is contemporary. Every day it's just moving from all of our waste streams throughout the nation, throughout the state, the nation, and the world into the atmosphere as methane. And that's another resource. Today, natural gas in this country has displaced coal in the Midwest, as Bill indicated, but it's also replacing fuel oil in the East for heating. Worldwide, it's displacing coal generation. Worldwide, it's moving into new markets, home heating markets, home cooking markets. Take a step back and think about the world and the energy resources used in the world. I mean, China and India alone commission one power plant every week, and we'll be doing that until 2020. That's 52 a year out until 2020. It's a coal plant. None of those are solar or gas. They're coal plants. Think of that. The gas resource can start to replace all of that, and you get a 60% reduction right away. What's happening in Japan? Japan's importing natural gas. What's happening in the Pacific-Asia trade is natural gas is starting to power ships. LNG, liquefied natural gas, is displacing bunker fuel. In Europe, all the river trade has gone from diesel to natural gas. It's all LNG. Maersk is looking at worldwide LNG fleets. Southern California Gas Company has been talking with the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach to figure out how are we going to refuel all of the ships, which, by the way, deliver 40% of all the container cargo in this country. How are we going to fuel all of those ships on natural gas? How are we going to liquefy it off of our pipeline system, build and then refuel those ships? Because in the next 5 to 10 years, most of the marine vessels worldwide will be moving from bunker fuel to liquefied natural gas. The Caribbean trade is already moving to natural gas. The Northwest trade is already moving to natural gas. Puget Sound just built a liquefaction facility to refuel all of the marine transport coming out of the Puget Sound. So when we step back and look at natural gas, we've got to realize it isn't this microcosm of California where activists and the press kind of have this false narrative that it's this terrible, dirty fossil fuel. Natural gas worldwide is perceived as a clean fuel that has a lot of uses. And interesting, there's all kinds of other gas resources that we don't think about. Japan is starting to harvest natural gas hydrates or hydrates out of the ocean floor. What is that? It's methane that's crystallized under the pressure and the cold temperatures in the deep ocean floor. And they're mining that as a resource for natural gas. In Canada, in the northeastern provinces, there are scientists that are looking at the permafrost, and they're very concerned because as that permafrost melts, methane hydrates, which are at the base of that permafrost, also melt, and methane goes into the atmosphere. And they're thinking about how do we capture that or how do we mine that to prevent that from going to the atmosphere and then use that as natural gas. It's simplistic to think of natural gas as just those pipelines delivering fuel, and that we really should get rid of pipelines and instead string electric wires everywhere and electrify everything. I think as we look at the future, there will be a diversity of fuels and resources, and we have to think smartly on how we develop them and maximize their utility together, not eliminate one or the other to over-rely on a sole source of energy. I think in the Q&A, I'll start talking about renewable resources and renewable methane, just like we talk about electricity, and we want electricity to come from renewable supplies. Over time, we're going to want natural gas to be replaced with renewable gas, fossil gas replaced with contemporary or renewable gas. And that's a debate that's raging across Europe right now. We're just starting that debate in California. You know, we've got 50 biomethane projects in California. We should have 5,000. Germany, a nation state about the size of California, it's got 5,600 of them. So we have a long way to go and a lot of politics to traverse. But I would say, and to sum this up, that the California Commission on Science and Technology concluded a report on natural gas storage. There's a whole lot of data in that, but at the bottom line, their final conclusion was California has many pathways out to the future, and even as we drive our GHGs down and develop renewable resources, there's a role for natural gas infrastructure and storage out to the 2050 timeframe, absent there any other plan that says there's not. So I think that for a long time to come, we'll all be relying on natural gas and renewable gas.
Thank you, George. We all want to welcome Irene Berga to the Verde Exchange Conference. Irene is the California Climate and Energy Manager for the Environmental Defense Fund. May have a different perspective on how long natural gas will remain the foundation of our energy economy. Prior to joining EDF, Irene worked on creating and implementing policies and programs that cut energy waste, boost local economies, and reduce harmful pollution in cities for the NRDC's City Energy Project. During her time in law school, she had several internships, including at the South Coast Air Quality Management District, where she supported prosecutors in air quality enforcement cases. And she also spent a semester at the Conservation Law Foundation, organizing and educating environmental justice communities about the harmful effects of air pollution. Irene, where do you see our energy mix moving, and how much time do you forecast for natural gas to remain as the foundation of this important national energy economy?
Thank you, Bill. So first of all, it's a privilege and honor to be on this esteemed panel, so thank you so much for inviting me. So I think that this panel poses an interesting question, and one that we need to see sort of holistically, which is how are we going to power our energy future in a way that is calling on and tackling our most urgent and pressing question, which is the warming of our planet. And specifically in California, how are we going to meet our climate and clean air targets, which are the most aggressive in the country, and we're also a global leader in this, with our changing energy needs and looking into the future and how we're going to sort of reduce that pollution and tackle those climate problems. So I want to zoom in a little bit on the issue of climate change. Looking at our natural gas dependency and the impact on climate, as my co-panelist pointed out, natural gas is almost entirely made up of methane, and when leaked into the air, it's about 87 times stronger than carbon dioxide in the short term. And natural gas is responsible for about a quarter of man-made global warming. The oil and gas sector is about the largest source of industrial-caused methane emissions in the U.S. There was a recent NASA study that showed that about half of the recent increase in global methane emissions actually comes from the fossil fuel industry. And the EPA estimates for methane from fossil fuels within our country has been rising, and it's pretty widely debated and known that the estimates from methane coming from the fossil fuel industry have been largely underestimated. So when we take into account the leaks that are coming from this industry, the climate benefit that comes from using natural gas is almost entirely canceled out. Leaks from the oil and gas supply chain is a big problem, and especially as sort of this infrastructure continues to age. In California, we have about over a century of legacy of oil and gas. The leaking problem continues to become a bigger and bigger problem. There's an estimated 100 billion cubic feet of natural gas released into the air in California every year, and so every year about more natural gas is released into the air than what happened in Aliso Canyon, the mega leak. That's a huge climate impact if we're really taking all of that into account. And as we know, the issue around climate is becoming more and more pressing. We don't have to look far to see how it's affecting our planet and having a devastating effect also on our economy. In California, we've seen some of the worst fires that in recent years. This year alone, we saw extreme drought followed by extreme rainfall, and of course, extreme drought took out all the vegetation, which caused mudslides, and this is displacing people and it's taking lives. And not only that, but it's having a huge impact on our economy. Nationally, about $25 billion are spent on mitigation and adaptation, and we're seeing sea level rise sort of recede into our coastline in California, and in places like Miami, it's becoming a really, really real pressing problem. And then, of course, we also have the public health issue that comes with sort of this leaky fossil fuel infrastructure. Alongside methane, oil and gas infrastructure releases co-pollutants that harm human health, like benzene, which is a known human carcinogen, and volatile organic compounds that contribute to smog and respiratory problems. And we know we have a huge air quality problem, especially in this city, LA. We are in non-attainment of the Clean Air Act, and that's definitely an issue that we need to take on. And it's especially an issue for those in closest proximity to these sites. So in California, about 1 million people live within a half-mile of an active oil and gas site. That's a huge amount of people, and we know that a half-mile is within sort of the danger zone of getting more acute onset of respiratory problems and also cancers. And this impact is also an equity issue. It affects low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately, which are already overburdened by a great series of environmental problems and poor air quality problems. So this is really a social justice and environmental justice issue as well. And so I think that taking all of that into account, we really need to look at how are we creating an energy supply that's going to be sustainable and that's going to provide a good and healthy quality of life for everybody. And I think that the transition that we've seen into clean energy futures is extremely promising, and we need to support policies that sort of clean up our current system, which California does lead on regulatory as far as inspections of oil and gas and LDAR, leak detection and repair programs, but more needs to be done given the kind of big problem around this leaking infrastructure. And we need to start to look at policies that move us away from polluting sources. And certainly we've seen a trend with SB 100. LA is also looking at how to get to 100% renewable energy, and there's also a lot of smaller cities in the Sierras and the like across the state that are looking to get to 100% renewable energy, which is really promising. And there's still important questions to ask there, like what does 100% renewable really mean, and what does that energy mix look like? And then the last thing I want to say is that there's also a great economic opportunity going the clean energy route. So we know that there's a 20% increase in clean energy jobs over the last few years. Renewable energy jobs have outpaced fossil fuel jobs nationally 2.5 to 1. And in California, about 9 to 1. So 9 renewable energy jobs to 1 fossil fuel job. It's the fastest growing industry, and there's, the Bureau of Labor Statistics just came out with a report recently that it projects that within the next 10 years, solar jobs are going to continue to boom. And we've already seen in places like Central Valley, it's providing really well-paying family-supporting jobs. The average income for a job in solar is about $78,000, and that's well above the national average wage. So this is really important, and it's also helping communities that need these jobs the most. So I think, to sum it up and to sort of answer your question, I think that the role of natural gas is rapidly changing, and I also think it's important to not look at it in a vacuum. But I think given the urgency and the pressing problem around climate change, and really the need to tackle our air quality issues aggressively and quickly, and in order to meet our climate targets, we're really going to have to see a transition happen. And certainly it's played a role, and it's playing a role, but I think that change is on the horizon, and it's not going to stop.
So for all three of you, how much do you think we can extend the role that natural gas plays by lowering its carbon content, by moving to more renewable sources of gas?
Yeah, and I know, first of all, I do feel compelled to discuss Irene's points. I would say in California in particular, we don't flare. We have had inspection programs on fugitive emissions from methane ever since I've been employed, which has been 30 years by the oil and gas industry. The Air Resources Board is currently out with us in cooperation inspecting all of our facilities, and they are not finding this huge source that's been articulated. I do recall last year's Verde Exchange when EDF put a pie chart up, which came from the California Air Resources Board, and the oil and gas contribution was a sliver compared to I hate to point any fingers at any of our business partners, but certainly in the dairy and ag issue in the areas, those are much, much larger sources for all of us to figure out how to economically control in this space. So I don't agree with some of the assertions about this industry's contribution, especially in the state of California. That being said, in many areas throughout the U.S., there are other activities that are being done by our industry to make sure that what Irene has articulated, that we do a better job. and that there are new technologies, there are even aircraft technologies to go over various fields to find if there are any specific areas of concern so that we can pinpoint them and deal with them. So I think a lot's being done in that area. Just the other piece I would say is in the LNG space, and I know certainly George touched on that, but it's an exciting conversation in LNG because it is really the new gas order. I mean, when you can take natural gas and compress it into a liquid 600 times its volume, the flexibility that gives you to transport it to places that need it is just amazing. And I think it's, I was reading a stat yesterday that one LNG ship supplies, I think, 70,000 homes worth of electricity in a year. So I think that George touched on that, and I just think that's a wonderful new growth opportunity area, and you're going to be hearing much more about it, and we are projecting to be actually net exporters of LNG in not too distant future. So I think that's also a very, very promising technology. And when you look at China, India, Asia, which George mentioned, most of this natural gas demand coming from, it fits so nicely into what their what their policies are around energy. It's just, again, for places like that to have an opportunity to take such a clean burning fuel and be able to make these kinds of greenhouse gas emission reductions just from the use of one single energy is something really to be excited about. And again, that's why I say I don't think it's a transition away from. I think it's what role does natural gas continue to play in the world, because it is a global conversation, to make sure that we can provide, again, reliable energy to as many people as we can, that it is meeting our climate change goals and our environmental goals, that it is allowing the economic side of the equation because it's extremely cost effective and extremely reliable and very clean, and that, again, that it fits into the very exciting conversations that I think you're hearing up here about the renewable side and the renewable natural gas side. So, I don't, Bill, that's my...
I appreciate it. George, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to comment, and in the spirit of thinking globally, acting locally, I'll deliver these comments. Step back and look at the world. Most of the developing world, much of the folks in the developing world rely on wood, grasses, and dung for heat and cooking. That's changing, and it needs to change. We don't want it to change to be coal. We want it to change to be other energy resources. There are renewable electric technologies like solar and micro wind, but there's also a lot of natural gas technologies like fuel cells and advanced combined heat and power and microturbines that have the opportunity to deliver electricity to villages and to deliver heat and power directly. LNG actually has a great opportunity to move into the developing world and to displace much dirtier resources. We look at the United States, and I'd like to just address some of the comments from Irene, because I think she conflates different studies by NASA. So NASA's national study looked at all these methane hotspots, and the conclusion was where there are oil and gas reserves. Some of those are actual operations, exploration, production operations, but many of them are simply reserves. That's because oil and gas over time moves to atmosphere. The methane moves to atmosphere. And so they have these high readings. In California, we got calls about concerns about pipeline leakage because NASA and JPL called us and said, oh my God, we're having these huge readings in the Central Valley and there's no oil production facilities there. You must have a huge leak. Well, no, those were dairy facilities. And as it turns out, and mentioned by Kathy, that the study done by the ARB that was the inventory of methane emissions showed that about 6 to 7% of methane emissions come from the pipeline system, but 85% of the methane emissions come from landfills, from dairies, from ag waste, from woodland waste, and from wastewater treatment, sewage treatment. So that's really the methane emission challenge. It isn't the oil and gas production and delivery systems. although there are methane emissions associated with the oil and gas delivery systems. The gas industry has been really focused on this for about 10 years. SoCalGas, we've been working on methane reduction, methane emission reductions for about 20 years. Actually, when under the Clinton administration, when Mary Nichols was Assistant Administrator of Air and Radiation, she developed the Natural Gas STAR program, which was a voluntary program to reduce methane emissions from the gas system. We were the signer of that accord that brought along other industrial players. Our leakage rate in studies done by EDF are way below 1% of throughput, which is what people put out there as the marker of whether you have a climate change positive or negative impact. I think we're 0.02 or 0.008, we're below what is that, hundreds of times below the 1% level in our system. Our system is one of the tightest systems, as is San Diego, and PG&E is pretty good. The challenge in the pipeline delivery system, frankly, are the old cities. And so San Francisco's a problem, and Baltimore, and Washington, and Philadelphia, and New York, and Boston, because these pipes were built 100 years ago or even longer, and it's hard to replace them because they're many feet below the surface of the streets, and it's a challenge. And that's where you actually have pretty high rates of leakage. We have pretty low rates of leakage, and as I indicated, the inventory suggests that the overwhelming share comes from the natural resources in the waste stream. So that becomes the focus for renewable gas. Why is that waste methane renewable gas? Well, think about it. That methane is coming from the decomposition of organic matter, whether it's the plant matter that lies on the ground and decomposes or is ingested and then through digestion decomposes either at a dairy or at a wastewater treatment facility. All of that ends up as methane to atmosphere. The idea here is to capture that methane. So let's think about that. The organic matter, that's plants. What do plants do? They grow through photosynthesis. What is that? It's they take CO2 and they grow. That's carbon entrapment. And when they decompose, it's methane to atmosphere. When you capture that methane, combust it, you produce CO2, the same level of CO2 that the organic matter took out of the atmosphere. It's a net zero carbon loop. And that's why it's a renewable resource, because every day it's continually renewed because plants are growing and we're eating plants or other animals are eating plants, and we have decay and we have methane. And so we see biomethane as a very important resource to move our gas supply from fossil to more renewable resources. We're looking at a future goal of 15 to 20% replacement from biomethane resources. Now that's a challenge, and there's a lot of debate about what's really realizable, but the resources are there, and how we realize that is the challenge. But I'll reflect that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when we started talking about renewable electric generation, we had wind and solar that was way out of sight in terms of price, and everybody said, well, it can't happen. Well, yeah, it can. If you put your mind to it, you can make it happen. And so our view is if you put your mind to it, you can decarbonize the pipeline sector just as we've decarbonized the electric transmission sector. And that isn't just a biomethane pathway. That's something we have to do. In fact, we just passed a law that requires us to capture 40% of that biomethane. So we have to do that. And once you capture it, what are you going to do with it? Well, you got to put it in the pipeline system and deliver it as renewable gas to somebody. But the other step, and we're seeing this deployed throughout Europe. In fact, I just got off the phone with senior execs from Engie, which is Gas de France, and the electric utility that's a combined company. And they've announced a goal of 100% renewable gas, not just renewable electricity, but renewable gas by 2050. And their vision is that electricity can become gas and gas can become electricity through electrolysis, deploying excess solar and wind through an electrolysis facility. It's called power to gas, producing hydrogen and then blending it or also methanating it. And there's different ways to methanate. One, biomethanation. You use actual microbes that eat hydrogen and eat CO2 and produce methane. And that's essentially another renewable methane molecule. They're actually blending at 6% renewable hydrogen in one region of their service territory, and they're blending at 12% in another region of their service territory. Germany has a national standard of 8% blending. Netherlands has a standard of 12% blending. So the world is moving in this direction. We have one project in California, a power-to-gas facility in UC Irvine. It uses all the excess solar from rooftop solar on the campus in the midday and produces hydrogen, and we put it in the gas system. And you're essentially then decarbonizing your gas supply. And it's R&D because we're looking at, how do you do it? What does it do to the pipes, to the system, to the connections, to other materials? And we see this being commercialized in the next 5 to 10 years. So we see the first pathway is biomethane, which we have to go down, and then developing the power-to-gas, hydrogen, green hydrogen pathways so we can manage gas and electric together. One of the things that Angie said, and this was the electric person saying, when we looked at modeling our 100% renewable electricity, we couldn't manage our grid. We couldn't make the system work. We needed massive economy-wide storage that batteries couldn't deliver. And even as we expect capacity and prices to go down, we realized we needed to convert electricity to hydrogen and hydrogen back to electricity. And so that's their vision. I think there's a lot of EU utilities that have that vision, and I think that's the direction we'll be going.
I want to make sure we have time for our audience to pose some questions. Are there questions from our attendees today that they would like to ask? This gentleman in the red shirt.
So with biofuel, I just want to make sure I have the right understanding. Is it a lesser CO2 intensive fuel, or is it's sort of not releasing sequester CO2, but recycling methane and CO2 from already released sources? So which is the correct understanding?
So conceptually, it's a net zero carbon loop, but in reality, depending on the different sources of methane, you could actually have net negative. So the concept is plants, when they die, they decay and produce methane. And if you capture that and combust the CO2, that's equivalent to the methane captured from the organic matter. But dairies produce concentrations of methane that actually exceed the CO2 entrapped. So you have net negative pathways. And there is a chart actually that ARB's laid out as part of their low carbon fuel standard, and it's on the website, that shows the different carbon intensities of different fuels. And you've got, diesel, gasoline, you've got natural gas, you got electricity, you have, biomethane, and then you have a bunch of these other dairy biomethane that are net negative up to net negative 200. So it really sort of depends on what your waste stream is. And it also depends on what resources you're using to produce the energies.
I just wanted to say really quickly, so I think biogas certainly has a role, but we need to take into account that when it leaks, we have a climate problem, and when it's combusted, it's still gas, it's combusted. So I think we need to weigh that out when we're talking about near zero emission versus zero emission, for example, zero emission vehicles.
I think when we talk about zero emission and near zero emission, we need to talk about a life cycle analysis. Zero emission vehicles have no tailpipe emissions, but they have a lot of emissions associated with generating the electricity to provide that electric vehicle. Same with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We'd love those to be green hydrogen, but the fact is 99% of the hydrogen vehicles today are running on fossil gas, fossil methane that goes through an SMR, steam methane reformation process to produce the hydrogen. What does that mean? It means the CO2 went out into the atmosphere of the factory, so you had clean hydrogen in your fuel cell vehicle. Well, same with electricity. That's clean electricity in the motor of the vehicle, but it was generated. Now we're increasing our renewable profile, but we're just coming to our 33%, and we'll get to 50% by 2030. But the rest of those resources are predominantly fossil. We'd like to see them be renewable methane, and then that's a much better coefficient in terms of CO2.
I agree. I think that the way that we get our power, it needs to come from clean energy power sources, and that's something that EDF is actually in a few proceedings in Sacramento trying to ensure.
Other questions?
Yeah, Bill, and unfortunately, we don't we don't have a lot of natural gas in California. I mean, it's associated gas that comes mostly from the production of oil, but I mean, most of, we even though we are a large producer in the U.S., we still only produce 38% of the crude oil we need, let alone much less natural gas. So you have to keep that sort of that supply demand where we produce it also in the equation.
Sir?
I would argue that largely the future of natural gas is an economic question shaped by political realities. And so in this post-Aliso Canyon era, how do you earn trust in the natural gas industry in those communities Irene's been talking about with older infrastructure that do have leaks, and earn trust?
I think you're right. It's all politics and economics. I wouldn't argue with you. How do you earn trust? I think you earn trust through doing good works. And in this case, you fix your leaks. You develop technology that reduces your emissions. I think the gas industry is focused on that agenda. I think Southern California Gas Company has been focused for a long, long time on managing methane leaks, developing technology to reduce those leaks, implementing different technologies. We've developed some of the protocols that are being used nationwide. There are debates about which detection system's better. The one that comes out of Silicon Valley or the one that comes out of West Texas, and we can debate all that, but at the end of the day, we are deploying advanced technologies to detect methane at lower and lower levels and deploying folks to reduce those leaks. I think the other side of it is that the end-use technologies, you have to modernize those end-use technologies and drive emissions to near zero levels or zero equivalent levels. We focused on industrial equipment, commercial equipment, and we're now focused on home equipment to drive emissions down, not just increase efficiency, which reduces GHGs, but to drive the combustion-related emissions that contribute to diminished air quality. And so you just simply have to be a good actor and undertake good works. I think if you look at a lot of the opinion research that you see published and consistent with our own research, that we have very high regard in public responses with respect to value for the money, cares about me as a customer. Our ratings typically are higher than other utilities. Now, one of the reasons why, and probably the most important reason why, is we're the cheapest bill people pay. We're the cheapest utility people pay. But that's an important point. We're a very economic energy resource. And so you have to stay economic. You have to do everything I described: reduce your leaks, manage and maintain your system, improve your system, develop end-use technologies that work better, more efficiently, lower emission. But you also have to deliver a resource that's increasingly cleaner, more renewable, and at a price that meets customers' expectations.
And the natural gas storage side is so important for our industry because we rely on natural gas to run our refineries. And so that storage piece is critical because you can't just ramp up and ramp down a refinery. You have to have a consistent source of reliable energy to produce the transportations we do every day so people can wake up and drive from A to B. So the storage piece, I think, too, George, you touched on, is a really, really important element.
Let me also comment on that. I mean, the NASA study, the JPL study, also, the continual monitoring also shows methane flares on hot spots, in the North San Fernando Valley. Well, it turns out it's over the landfill, not over the Aliso Canyon facility. People have this sense, well, it's this leaky facility. Well, it's not. And the methane infrared detection is telling us that. People talk about this disaster as the largest methane leak in U.S. history, and as an industrial accident by an operator, it may well be, although we've been in this business 150 years, and I don't have knowledge of how many other leaks or industrial accidents there have been. But I talked about the inventory of where methane comes from. So the amount of methane that came out of the Aliso Canyon over the 2 months that it took to finally plug that leak was equal to about 5% of the methane emissions from California's dairy cows in one year. So just compare that. 95% of California's dairy cows still producing that methane every year, and after the first year, now it's 100%. So, you know, it was a large volume of methane. But then if you look at the inventory, you realize how large the inventory is of methane, which to us as the gas company says how large a resource base is out there and what's the opportunity to capture it.
If I may really quickly, I think that certainly in California, the agriculture industry does have a larger contributor to methane than oil and gas, but it is not insignificant what's coming from oil and gas, and I don't think it's a proper assessment to compare the gigantic emissions that come from agriculture. I mean, both are not good and egregious, so I don't think it's fair to compare one to the other. And I think that while for example, in the case of Aliso Canyon, certainly now there are a lot of standards that have that I think your company has responded to improve operations and efficiency and make sure that leaks are minimized. Unfortunately, it took an incident like that for a lot of these standards and for regulators to pay attention and to sort of enforce a lot of what we've seen now with the double casing and that kind of thing, and to reduce and mitigate the harm of leaks. And another thing I want to point out is that often we don't see equal reactions and equal responses depending on where you live. So while Aliso Canyon certainly was a disaster, we see leaks happen all the time in other communities, and we don't see regulators jumping at the bit. And these are impacts that folks are feeling over a long period of time, and they're affecting their health in a chronic way. So I think that we need to kind of look holistically at the oil and gas industry and what impacts that's having on human health and what cost that means. What cost is that? I mean, that's a huge amount of cost in terms of healthcare, in terms of human life and human capital. And so while dollar signs are certainly important here, there's also an economic burden here, and one that is disproportionately carried by some of these communities.
Will you join me in thanking our panelists? We're just a moment beyond our time.